The debt collectors had given them exactly 1 week, 7 days to come up with $300, or the Murphy farm would be sold at auction to the highest bidder. Rosalie Murphy stood in the faded kitchen of her childhood home, watching her mother's hands shake as she counted the meager coins in the mason jar for the fifth time that morning. $12.37. That was all they had left in the world. Marriage was her only escape, but to a man she'd never spoken to, a stranger 23 years her senior, who could afford to buy a wife when loneliness got the better of him. "There has to be another way, Ma," Rosalie whispered, though she knew there wasn't. They'd already sold everything of value. Her father's tools, her grandmother's wedding ring, even the good china that had made the journey from County Cork. The mining accident that took Patrick Murphy 6 months ago had left them with nothing but grief and mounting bills. Her mother, Bridget, looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "William Bradford made an offer," she said quietly. "A good offer. He's willing to pay off all our debts and give us enough to start fresh." Rosalie's stomach churned. She'd heard the whispers about William Bradford around town. 45 years old, they said. A successful rancher who owned half the county. His first wife had died in childbirth 5 years ago, and he'd been living alone in that big house ever since. The kind of man who could snap his fingers and have whatever he wanted, including a desperate young woman with no other options. But what exactly did he want from her? And what would happen if she couldn't give it to him? At 22, Rosalie was already considered past her prime by frontier standards. Her auburn hair and green eyes might catch a man's attention in town, but her sharp tongue and stubborn streak had driven away every potential suitor. She was too independent for most men's liking, too willing to speak her mind when she should stay silent. The sound of approaching hooves made them both freeze. Through the kitchen window, Rosalie could see a well-dressed man riding up their dusty path on a magnificent black stallion. Even from a distance, she could tell this was William Bradford. He sat his horse with the confidence of a man who owned everything his eyes could see. "He's come for his answer," Bridget whispered. Rosalie's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the man dismount. He was taller than she'd expected, with broad shoulders and graying hair beneath his black hat. When he removed it and knocked politely on their door, she caught a glimpse of something unexpected. Not the cold, calculating gaze of a man used to getting his way, but eyes marked by a familiar sadness. But appearances could be deceiving, especially when a man had the power to control every aspect of her future. As her mother moved toward the door, Rosalie steeled herself for what was coming. This conversation would determine whether she spent the rest of her life as a cherished partner or a purchased possession, and she was about to find out which man William Bradford really was. "Mrs. Murphy? Miss Murphy?" His voice was deep but gentle when Bridget opened the door. "I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to speak with you both about our arrangement." There was something in the way he said it, not possessive or demanding, but almost apologetic, as if he understood this wasn't the romantic proposal most young women dreamed of. "Come in, Mr. Bradford," Bridget said, stepping aside. We were just discussing your generous offer." William Bradford stepped into their humble kitchen, his presence seeming to fill the small space. But instead of the arrogant swagger Rosalie had expected, he moved carefully, respectfully, like a man aware he was entering someone else's sanctuary. His clothes were well made but not ostentatious, a simple brown suit that spoke of quality without flaunting wealth. "Miss Murphy," he said, turning to face her directly, "I want you to know that I don't take this lightly. Marriage should be based on affection and mutual respect, not financial necessity. But I also understand that sometimes life forces us into difficult circumstances." His honesty caught her off guard. She'd prepared herself for a cold business transaction, not this thoughtful man who seemed genuinely concerned about her feelings. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, not from cruelty, but from squinting into too many sunrises and carrying too much grief. "What exactly are you asking of me, Mr. Bradford?" she asked, meeting his gaze despite her racing pulse. "Companionship," he said simply. "Someone to share meals with, to talk to in the evenings. Someone who might help me remember what it feels like to have a family again." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "I'm not looking for a servant or a woman to dominate. I'm looking for a partner, if such a thing is possible under these circumstances." The sincerity in his voice made something twist in Rosalie's chest. This wasn't the controlling older man she'd imagined. This was a lonely widower who missed having someone to care for. "And if I can't give you that," she asked quietly, "if I can't learn to feel affection for you, then we'll be two people sharing a house and making the best of an unusual situation," he replied without hesitation. "I won't force anything, Miss Murphy. You have my word on that." 3 days later, Rosalie stood before the cracked mirror in her bedroom, adjusting the cream-colored dress that had been her mother's wedding gown. They'd spent the previous evening taking it in, shortening the sleeves, trying to make it fit her smaller frame. The fabric was yellowed with age and smelled faintly of lavender and mothballs, but it was the only thing that resembled wedding attire they could afford. Her hands trembled as she pinned a small cluster of wildflowers to her hair. Daisies and black-eyed Susans she'd gathered at dawn from the fields that would no longer be theirs after today. In just 2 hours, she would be Mrs. William Bradford, wife to a man she'd spoken to exactly once. "You look beautiful, love," Bridget said from the doorway, though her voice cracked with emotion. "Your father would be so proud." Would he? Rosalie wondered. Patrick Murphy had been a dreamer, a man who believed in following your heart and fighting for what you loved. Would he have approved of his daughter marrying for money, even if it meant survival? Or would he have found another way, some option she was too frightened or too practical to see? A knock at the front door interrupted her thoughts. Through her window, she could see neighbors beginning to gather in their small yard. Word had spread quickly through their tight-knit community about the unusual wedding. Some came out of genuine affection for the Murphy family, but others were drawn by curiosity about the arrangement between the young Irish girl and the wealthy rancher. "That'll be Mrs. Henderson with the cake," Bridget said, hurrying downstairs. Rosalie remained at her window, watching the scene unfold below. Mrs. Henderson had indeed arrived with a simple cake balanced carefully in her arms. Behind her came the Kowalski family from the neighboring farm, their 4 children dressed in their Sunday best. Then the Andersons, the Pratts, and even old Mr. Jameson, who rarely left his property except for church. They were all here to witness her sacrifice. The thought sent a chill down her spine. Because that's what this was, wasn't it? A sacrifice. She was offering herself up on the altar of financial necessity, trading her freedom and her future for her family's survival. And everyone knew it. Another knock. This one more authoritative. Rosalie's breath caught as she saw Reverend Walsh approaching their door, his black suit and solemn expression making this feel suddenly, terrifyingly real. In 30 minutes, he would speak the words that would bind her to William Bradford for the rest of her life. "Rosalie," her mother called from downstairs. "It's time, sweetheart." Her legs felt like water as she made her way down the narrow staircase, gripping the banister to keep from stumbling. The small crowd in their yard had grown, and she could hear the murmur of voices through the thin walls. Some were speaking in hushed, sympathetic tones, but others carried the sharp edge of gossip. "Shame, really, a girl her age having to marry for money. Though I suppose she could do worse. Bradford's got a good reputation." Still, 23 years between them makes you wonder what he's really after. Rosalie forced herself to ignore the whispers as she stepped onto their small front porch. The crowd fell silent, all eyes turning to examine the bride who was marrying for survival rather than love. She held her chin high, determined not to let them see how terrified she was. And then she saw him. William Bradford stood near the old oak tree at the edge of their property, speaking quietly with Reverend Walsh. He wore a dark suit that fit him perfectly, and his hair was neatly combed beneath his black hat. When he looked up and saw her, something flickered across his face. Not possession or satisfaction, but what looked almost like regret. He approached slowly, his movements careful and measured. When he reached the porch, he removed his hat and looked up at her with those same sad, kind eyes she remembered from their first meeting. "Miss Murphy," he said softly, his voice meant only for her, "you look lovely, but I want you to know, if you've changed your mind, if this isn't what you want, just say the word. I'll pay your family's debts anyway. No strings attached." The offer stunned her. Here was her chance to escape, to back out of this arrangement without consequence. But what then? She would still be a burden to her mother, still be a woman with no prospects and no future. At least this way, Her sacrifice would have meaning. "I haven't changed my mind," she said, though her voice was barely above a whisper. He nodded, but she caught a flash of something in his expression. Disappointment? Relief? It was gone too quickly for her to be sure. "Then shall we begin?" Reverend Walsh called out, his booming voice carrying across the yard. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. Rosalie heard the words, the promises to love, honor, and obey, but they felt like they were happening to someone else. Her responses came automatically, years of church attendance having embedded the proper replies deep in her memory. William's voice was steady and sure when he spoke his vows, but she noticed he paused slightly at the word love, as if he too understood the impossibility of promising something that couldn't be forced. When Reverend Walsh pronounced them husband and wife, William leaned down to brush a gentle kiss across her cheek, a gesture that was proper and respectful, but completely devoid of passion. The crowd applauded politely, but Rosalie could feel the weight of their judgment, their pity, their curiosity about what would happen next. But what would happen next? As Mrs. Henderson cut the cake and neighbors offered their congratulations, Rosalie realized she had no idea what her new life would actually look like. Would William expect her to share his bed immediately? Would he demand the rights of a husband even though they were strangers? The thought made her stomach clench with fear. As if sensing her distress, William appeared at her side. "Mrs. Bradford," he said, and the name sounded strange on his lips. "When you're ready, I'll take you home." Home. His house would be her home now, but it felt like she was being transported to a foreign country where she didn't speak the language or understand the customs. 20 minutes later, she was sitting beside him in his wagon, her few belongings packed in a single trunk behind them. The crowd had dispersed, and her mother had tearfully kissed her goodbye, whispering promises to visit soon. Now it was just the two of them, heading toward a future neither of them had planned. "Mrs. Bradford," William said as they rode through the gathering dusk, "I know this is difficult, but I want you to know that you're safe with me. Whatever else happens, you're safe. Safe." It should have been comforting, but Rosalie couldn't shake the feeling that she was riding toward her own unknown destiny, and there was no turning back. The Bradford ranch house appeared through the twilight like something from a dream. 2 stories of weathered cedar and stone, with a wraparound porch and flower boxes beneath every window. It was easily 3 times the size of the Murphy cabin, set amid rolling pastures where cattle grazed in the fading light. Rosalie had known William was prosperous, but seeing his home made the gulf between their backgrounds feel even wider. "It's beautiful," she said softly, meaning it despite her nervousness. William pulled the wagon to a stop near the front steps and turned to look at the house, as if seeing it through her eyes. "My first wife, Margaret, she had a gift for making things beautiful. Most of what you see was her doing." His voice carried a familiar note of sadness when he spoke of her. As he helped Rosalie down from the wagon, she noticed how careful he was not to touch her more than necessary, his hand steady on her waist just long enough to ensure she was safely on the ground before immediately stepping back. Everything about his behavior suggested a man trying very hard not to frighten her. The front door opened before they reached it, revealing a middle-aged Mexican woman with graying hair and kind eyes. She wore a simple brown dress and an apron dusted with flour. "Senor Bradford," she said with a warm smile, "and you must be Senora Bradford. Welcome home." "Rosa, this is my wife, Rosalie," William said, and Rosalie noticed he didn't stumble over the word this time. "Rosalie, this is Rosa Mendoza. She manages the household and keeps me from starving to death." Rosa's laugh was rich and welcoming. "Come, Senora, you must be tired after such a big day. I have dinner waiting, and I've prepared the blue room for you." The blue room? Rosalie had expected to be shown to William's bedroom, their bedroom, but Rosa was leading her up the wide staircase toward what was clearly a separate space. Her confusion must have shown on her face because William cleared his throat. "I thought you might prefer your own room, at least initially," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Until you're more comfortable with all of this." Relief flooded through her so suddenly that her knees nearly buckled. She'd been dreading this moment all day. The awkward transition from stranger to wife, the physical intimacy expected of marriage. But William was offering her time, space, the chance to adjust to her new life without pressure. Thank you, she whispered, and meant it more than he could possibly know. The blue room was lovely, wallpapered in a soft floral pattern, with a four-poster bed, a writing desk by the window, and a wardrobe that could hold 10 times the clothes she owned. Fresh flowers sat on the bedside table, and someone had turned down the coverlet and left a clean nightgown folded on the pillow. Rosa thought you might not have had time to pack everything you needed, William explained, seeing her surprise at the nightgown. She can take you into town tomorrow to get whatever else you require. This is more than I expected, Rosalie said, running her fingers over the smooth cotton of the nightgown. It was simple but well made, far nicer than anything she'd ever owned. What did you expect? William asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them. What had she expected? A man who demanded his conjugal rights immediately? Someone who would treat her like property he'd purchased? She realized she didn't know how to answer without insulting him. I don't know, she said finally. I've never been married before. Something that might have been a smile flickered across his face. Neither have I, really. Not like this. He paused, then added, Would you like to freshen up before dinner? Rosa's been cooking all afternoon, and she'll be offended if we don't do justice to her meal. Dinner was served in a dining room that could have seated 12, though they sat at one end of the long table with Rosa fussing over them like a mother hen. The food was delicious. Roasted chicken with herbs, fresh bread, vegetables from the garden, and a berry pie that melted on Rosalie's tongue. Rosa's been with the family for 15 years, William explained, as the housekeeper bustled back to the kitchen for more butter. She came here when Margaret was pregnant with... He stopped abruptly, his face clouding over. With your child? Rosalie asked gently. He nodded, his hands tightening on his napkin. Sarah. We lost them both during the birth. Rosa helped me through the worst of it afterward. I don't know what I would have done without her. The pain in his voice was so raw that Rosalie felt her own eyes sting with tears. She'd lost her father, but William had lost his entire family in one terrible day. No wonder he seemed so careful, so afraid of causing more pain. I'm sorry, she said softly. That must have been unbearable. It was. He looked up at her, and she saw something in his expression she hadn't expected. Gratitude that she understood. I thought I'd never want a family again. But the loneliness, it's been harder than I anticipated. They finished their meal in comfortable silence after that, both lost in their own thoughts. When Rosa began clearing the dishes, William stood and offered Rosalie his arm. Would you like to see the rest of the house? Or are you too tired? She wasn't tired. She was too nervous to be tired. So she accepted his arm and let him show her around her new home. The parlor was elegant but comfortable, with a piano that he mentioned Margaret had loved to play. The library was William's domain, lined floor to ceiling with books on everything from cattle ranching to poetry. His study was masculine and practical, with ledgers and maps covering the large desk. Do you read? He asked, noticing how her eyes lingered on the book spines. When I can find the time. My father taught me, though my mother thinks it's a waste for a woman to fill her head with too many ideas. Feel free to borrow anything that interests you, he said immediately. Margaret always said a house without readers was just a building. As they climbed the stairs to return to their respective rooms, Rosalie found herself studying her new husband. He was nothing like what she'd expected. Yes, he was older, but not in a way that made her feel like a child. His grief had given him a gentleness that younger men often lacked, and his obvious respect for his late wife suggested he was capable of seeing women as equals rather than possessions. At the top of the stairs, they paused outside her door. An awkward moment stretched between them. The moment when, in a normal marriage, a husband might kiss his wife goodnight or suggest they retire together. But William simply cleared his throat and took a step back. If you need anything during the night, my room is just down the hall, he said. Rosa's room is downstairs near the kitchen. And, he hesitated, then continued, the doors don't lock from the outside. Only from the inside. You're free to come and go as you please. It was such an odd thing to say that it took Rosalie a moment to understand. He was telling her she wasn't a prisoner, that he wouldn't force his way into her room, that she could leave if she chose to, though where she would go with no money and no family to return to, she couldn't imagine. Thank you, she said again, though the words felt inadequate for everything he was giving her. Good night, Mrs. Bradford, he said formally, touching the brim of his hat even though they were indoors. Good night, Mr. Bradford, she replied, then impulsively added, William. His name on her lips seemed to surprise them both. He looked at her for a long moment, and she thought she saw something warm flicker in his eyes before he nodded and walked away down the hall. Alone in her beautiful blue room, Rosalie sank onto the edge of the bed and tried to process everything that had happened. This morning she'd been a desperate girl with no options. Now she was the wife of a man who owned more land than she'd ever imagined, who treated her with a respect she'd never experienced, who asked for nothing more than her presence in his lonely house. She changed into the soft nightgown and slipped between sheets that smelled of lavender and sunshine. Through her window she could see the moon rising over the pastures where William's cattle grazed peacefully. Somewhere down the hall, her husband was lying in his own bed, probably staring at the ceiling and wondering what he'd gotten himself into. But as she drifted toward sleep, Rosalie realized something that surprised her. For the first time in months, she felt safe. Not just physically safe, though that was part of it. She felt emotionally safe, protected by a man who seemed to understand that trust was something that had to be earned, not demanded. Maybe this strange arrangement could work after all. Maybe William Bradford was exactly the kind of man who could teach her that marriage didn't have to mean the loss of herself. Time would tell. But tonight, for the first time since her father's death, Rosalie Murphy Bradford fell asleep without fear. Rosalie woke to the sound of voices drifting through her open window. The sun was already well up, painting golden rectangles across her bedroom floor, and she realized with a start that she'd slept later than she had in months. At home, at her mother's house, she would have been up before dawn, tending to chores and trying to stretch their meager supplies into something resembling meals. She dressed quickly in one of her 2 everyday dresses and made her way downstairs, following the aroma of coffee and bacon toward the kitchen. Through the back door, she could see William standing near the corral with 3 ranch hands, their voices carrying on the morning breeze as they discussed the day's work. Buenos dias, señora, Rosa greeted her warmly, bustling over with a plate piled high with eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits. Sit, sit. El Patron said to let you sleep as long as you needed. I should have been up hours ago, Rosalie protested, though she gratefully accepted the coffee Rosa pressed into her hands. I don't want to be a burden. Rosa laughed, the sound rich and maternal. A burden? Mija, this house has been too quiet for too long. It needs a woman's presence again. She paused in her bustling to study Rosalie's face. You slept well? No bad dreams? No bad dreams, Rosalie confirmed, surprised by the truth of it. Despite everything, the strange house, the strange circumstances, she'd slept more peacefully than she had since her father's death. Bueno, Rosa nodded approvingly. Senor Bradford was worried you might be uncomfortable. He was up early, checking that everything was ready for you. Through the window, Rosalie watched her husband gesturing toward the far pasture, his posture confident and commanding, in a way that reminded her he was a successful businessman, not just the gentle man who'd offered her a separate bedroom. The contrast intrigued her. Which was the real William Bradford, the authoritative rancher or the careful, grieving widower? After breakfast, Rosa insisted on showing her the rest of the house she'd missed the night before. The root cellar, the pantry, the sewing room that had once been Margaret's domain. Each room told a story of the woman who'd lived here before, and Rosalie found herself wondering what it would be like to follow in the footsteps of someone so clearly beloved. She was a good woman, Rosa said softly, noticing how Rosalie lingered over a half-finished sampler, still stretched on its embroidery hoop. But sad sometimes. She lost 3 babies before Sarah, and each loss broke her heart a little more. William mentioned they died together, Rosalie said carefully, during childbirth. Rosa's face clouded. See, it was a terrible winter, that one. The doctor couldn't get through the snow in time. And I knew about babies, but not about the problems that can happen. We lost them both in one night. She crossed herself quickly. Senor Bradford, he blamed himself, said he should have taken her to town earlier, should have insisted she stay with the doctor. But how can a man know such things? The weight of William's grief suddenly made more sense to Rosalie. He hadn't just lost his wife and child. He'd lost them while feeling responsible for their deaths. No wonder he was so careful now, so determined not to cause more pain. "He's been alone all this time," she asked. "Alone except for me and the men who work the ranch. Oh, the senoras from town. They tried to catch his attention, brought casseroles and offers to help with the house. But he wasn't ready. Maybe he's still not ready, but—" Rosa shrugged expressively. "A man can't grieve forever. Sometimes he needs someone to remind him that life can be good again." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of boots on the back porch. William appeared in the doorway, his hat in his hands and dust on his clothes from the morning's work. "Good morning, Rosalie," he said, and she noticed he used her first name this time. "I hope you slept well." "Very well, thank you." She felt suddenly shy under his gaze, aware that she was still learning how to be a wife, even an unconventional one. "Rosa was just showing me around." "Would you like to see the rest of the property?" he asked. "I could saddle a gentle mare for you if you ride." "I do, though it's been a while." Her father had taught her on their old workhorse, but they'd sold him months ago. "Excellent. Rosa, could you pack us something for lunch? I thought we might ride out to the north pasture." An hour later, Rosalie found herself mounted on a sweet-tempered chestnut mare named Buttercup, following William across his vast holdings. The morning air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of sage and wildflowers. For the first time in months, she felt something that might have been happiness stirring in her chest. "How long have you lived here?" she asked as they rode side by side. 15 years. I came out from Ohio after the war, looking for a fresh start. Bought this land from a family that was moving on to California." He paused, his eyes scanning the horizon with obvious pride. "It was pretty rough when I got here. Just a small cabin and a few head of cattle. Margaret and I built it up together." "She helped with the ranch work?" "Margaret could rope a calf as well as any of my men," William said with a smile that transformed his entire face. "Her father raised her to be practical. Said a frontier woman needed to know how to do everything, not just the pretty accomplishments they teach ladies back east." They crested a small hill, and William pulled his horse to a stop. Spread out below them was a sight that took Rosalie's breath away. Hundreds of cattle grazing in a valley dotted with wildflowers, while a clear stream wound through the center like a silver ribbon. "This is the heart of the ranch," William said quietly. "Everything else radiates out from here." "It's beautiful." The words were inadequate, but she meant them. She'd never seen so much open space, so much potential. At her family's farm, they'd struggled to keep a handful of chickens fed. This was prosperity on a scale she'd never imagined. They dismounted near the stream to eat the lunch Rosa had packed: thick sandwiches, fresh fruit, and sweet tea that tasted like sunshine. As they sat on a blanket beneath a cottonwood tree, Rosalie found herself studying her husband's profile. The lines around his eyes were more pronounced in the bright sunlight, and she could see threads of silver in his dark hair, but there was something peaceful about him here in this place he'd built. "You love it here," she observed. "I do. It saved me in a way. After the war, I wasn't sure I wanted to keep living. I'd seen too much death, too much destruction. But out here, building something instead of tearing it down, it gave me a purpose again." "What did you do during the war?" His expression darkened. "I was a cavalry officer. Spent 4 years fighting other Americans over something that should never have required fighting." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "I promised myself that when it was over, I'd never hurt another person if I could help it." The statement hung between them, and Rosalie understood it was as much a promise to her as it was a confession about his past. This man who could command respect from his workers, who'd built an empire from nothing, who'd survived war and devastating loss, he was promising her that he would never use his strength to hurt her. "Is that why you offered me my own room?" she asked softly. "Why you told me I could leave if I wanted to?" "Partly," he met her eyes directly, "but mostly because I remember what it feels like to be trapped. Different circumstances, but I spent 4 years taking orders from men who saw soldiers as tools to be used and discarded. I swore I'd never treat another person that way. The vulnerability in his admission made something flutter in Rosalie's chest. This wasn't the distant, calculating older man she'd feared marrying. This was someone who understood powerlessness, who chose in gentleness, not from weakness, but from strength. "What happened to Margaret's family?" she asked, changing the subject before the moment became too intense. "They moved back east after she died. Her mother blamed me for not getting her to a doctor sooner. She wasn't wrong." His voice carried the weight of old guilt. "They offered to take Margaret's things with them, but I couldn't let go of them yet. And now? Now I think maybe it's time." He looked at her carefully. "I don't want you to feel like you're living in a shrine to my first wife. This is your home now too. You should be able to make it yours." The offer surprised her. Most men would expect their new wives to simply accept whatever arrangements had existed before. But William was offering her the chance to create her own space, her own life, even if their marriage wasn't conventional. "I wouldn't want to erase her memory," Rosalie said carefully. "You couldn't if you tried. But maybe there's room for both, for remembering what was and building something new." As they rode back toward the house that afternoon, Rosalie found herself seeing everything differently. The ranch wasn't just William's kingdom. It was a place where two people had built a life together, where love had flourished and tragedy had struck, where a lonely man was now offering her the chance to write a new chapter. She still didn't love him. How could she, after knowing him for barely 2 days? But she was beginning to respect him, to see the man beneath the arrangement. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start with. After all, the strongest foundations were built slowly, stone by careful stone. The trouble started 3 weeks after the wedding, on a Tuesday morning when Rosalie was helping Rosa tend the vegetable garden behind the house. She'd fallen into a comfortable routine at the ranch, mornings spent learning household management from Rosa, afternoons reading in William's library or exploring the grounds, evenings sharing quiet dinners and increasingly easy conversation with her husband. It was the kind of life she'd never dared dream of, and perhaps that should have warned her it was too good to last. "Senora," Rosa said suddenly, straightening from the tomato plants with concern creasing her weathered face. "Someone comes." Rosalie looked up to see a dust cloud approaching, fast along the main road. As the rider drew closer, she recognized Billy Henderson, the youngest son of their nearest neighbors. He was pushing his horse hard, and even from a distance, she could see the urgency in his posture. "Mrs. Bradford," he called out as he reined in near the garden gate. "Is Mr. Bradford here? I need to speak with him right away." "He's out with the cattle," Rosalie replied, brushing dirt from her hands. "What's wrong, Billy?" The boy, he couldn't be more than 16, looked uncomfortable addressing her directly. In the 3 weeks since her marriage, she'd noticed that many of the local families weren't quite sure how to treat her. She was William Bradford's wife, which commanded respect, but she was also the Murphy girl who'd married for money, which invited speculation. "It's about your ma, Mrs. Bradford," Billy said finally. She's in trouble." Ice flooded Rosalie's veins. "What kind of trouble?" "Those debt collectors came back. Said the arrangement with Mr. Bradford didn't cover all the debts. They're saying your pa owed money to other folks too, and now they want to collect from your mom. They've given her till Friday to pay up, or they'll take the cabin and what's left of the land." Rosalie's knees nearly buckled. She'd thought their financial troubles were over, that William's payment had solved everything. But apparently her father's debts had been even deeper than they'd known. "How much?" she asked quietly. "Near $200, Billy said, and the number hit her like a physical blow. "My pa wanted you to know right away. He says if there's anything we can do." But they both knew the Hendersons were barely making ends meet themselves. $200 might as well have been $2,000 for people like them. "Thank you for riding out, Billy," Rosalie managed. I'll figure something out." After the boy left, Rosalie sank onto the garden bench, her mind racing. $200. Where could she possibly get that kind of money? She had no assets, no income of her own. Everything she had, her home, her food, her very clothes, belonged to William now. The thought of asking him for help made her stomach clench with shame. He'd already paid $300 to marry her, had given her more kindness and consideration than she'd dared hope for. How could she ask for even more? What would he think of a wife who came with hidden costs, whose family couldn't manage their own affairs. Mija, Rosa said gently, settling beside her on the bench. Bad news. My mother, Rosalie whispered, and found herself pouring out the whole story. Rosa listened without judgment, occasionally making soft sounds of sympathy. Senor Bradford will help, Rosa said when Rosalie finished. He is a good man, and your family is his family now. But I can't just keep taking from him, Rosalie protested. What kind of wife does that make me? He already sacrificed so much to marry me, and now you are thinking like a foolish girl instead of a smart woman, Rosa said firmly. Marriage is not about keeping score, Mija. It is about facing troubles together. That evening, Rosalie paced her bedroom floor, trying to work up the courage to tell William about her mother's situation. They developed a routine of talking on the front porch after dinner, sharing the events of their days and slowly learning about each other. But tonight, she couldn't bring herself to spoil their peaceful evening with more financial problems. She was still wrestling with her decision when she heard horses approaching the house. Through her window, she could see William riding in with two of his men, their faces grim in the lamplight. Something was wrong. Hurrying downstairs, she reached the front door, just as William stepped onto the porch. His clothes were dusty, and there was a hard edge to his expression she hadn't seen since their wedding day. What's happened? She asked immediately. Someone's been cutting our fences, he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Stampeded about 50 head of cattle into the canyon. We managed to round up most of them, but we lost at least a dozen over the edge. Rosalie's hand flew to her throat. Who would do such a thing? Good question. William removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair. Could be rustlers, could be someone with a grudge. We'll keep extra watch tonight, but... He trailed off, studying her face in the lamplight. You look upset. Did something happen while I was gone? The concern in his voice nearly undid her. Here he was, dealing with someone actively sabotaging his ranch, and he was worried about her emotional state. The contrast between his problems and hers made her feel even more ashamed of her family situation. It's nothing that can't wait, she said quickly. You have enough to worry about. But William stepped closer, his eyes searching her face. Rosalie, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. The kindness in his voice broke down her last defenses. Before she could stop herself, the whole story came tumbling out. Billy's visit, the additional debts, her mother's desperate situation. William listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When she finished, the silence stretched between them like a chasm. Rosalie couldn't bring herself to meet his eyes, couldn't bear to see disappointment or resentment there. How long have you been carrying this alone? He asked finally. Since this morning. William, I know what you're thinking. No, he said quietly. You don't. He moved to the porch railing, staring out at the dark landscape. You're thinking I'm angry about the money, that I'm regretting our arrangement. Aren't you? The words came out smaller than she'd intended. He turned to face her, and in the lamplight, she could see something that looked almost like hurt in his eyes. Rosalie, do you really think so little of me? Do you think I'm the kind of man who would abandon your family over money? I think you're the kind of man who's already done more than enough, she said honestly. I think you married a woman whose family clearly can't manage their own affairs, and now you're stuck dealing with problems that just keep multiplying. Listen to me carefully, William said, his voice firm but not unkind. When I married you, I took on responsibility for your welfare and your family's welfare. That's not a burden. It's an obligation I accepted willingly. More than that, it's something I want to do. But $200 is money I can afford to spend? He stepped closer, and she could see the sincerity in his expression. Rosalie, I know this arrangement wasn't what either of us planned. But your mother is family now. Her troubles are my troubles. That's what marriage means, even when it starts the way ours did. The relief that flooded through her was so intense, it left her feeling weak. You'll help her? Of course I'll help her. He paused, then added more gently, but I need you to promise me something. No more carrying these burdens alone. If something's wrong, if you're worried or frightened or need anything at all, you come to me. That's what a husband is for. Even when the problems aren't really mine, when they're my family's mistakes, Especially then. His voice was absolutely certain. We're partners now, Rosalie. Partners share their troubles. But their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Multiple riders this time, moving fast. William's hand instinctively moved to the gun at his side as he stepped protectively in front of Rosalie. Bradford, a voice called out of the darkness. We need to talk. 6 men emerged from the shadows, their faces hard and their intentions unclear. The leader, a man Rosalie didn't recognize, wore expensive clothes that marked him as someone with money and influence. Mr. Calhoun, William said, and there was no warmth in his greeting. What brings you to my property at this hour? You know damn well what brings me here, Calhoun replied, dismounting with aggressive confidence. Someone's been hitting ranches all through the valley. Cutting fences, scattering cattle. Word is you've had your own troubles tonight. Word travels fast, William observed neutrally. It does when a man's been asking questions around town about his neighbor's business. Funny thing is, these troubles didn't start until you brought home your new wife. Calhoun's gaze shifted to Rosalie, and she didn't like what she saw there. Makes a man wonder if someone's trying to stir up trouble for folks who didn't approve of certain arrangements. The implication was clear, and Rosalie felt heat flood her cheeks. This man was suggesting that either she or her family was behind the attacks on local ranches, using her marriage to William as some kind of cover. That's quite an accusation, Calhoun, William said, his voice dangerously quiet. I hope you have evidence to back it up. I have questions that need answers. Like why a man with your reputation would suddenly marry a girl young enough to be his daughter, whose family's known for not paying their debts. That was the final straw. Rosalie stepped out from behind William, her chin raised defiantly. My family pays their debts, Mr. Calhoun, and my marriage is none of your business? Everything's my business when it threatens the stability of this valley, Calhoun shot back. Your people have been nothing but trouble since they arrived. Maybe it's time they moved on. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun, and Rosalie realized their troubles were just beginning. I think it's time you and your men left my property, Calhoun, William said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. His hand remained near his gun, and Rosalie could see the tension coiled in his shoulders like a spring ready to snap. Calhoun's eyes narrowed, but he didn't back down. This isn't over, Bradford. Strange things started happening right after you brought that girl home, and folks are starting to notice. If I were you, I'd be asking some hard questions about who I married and what kind of family I tied myself to. If I were you, William replied evenly, I'd be more concerned about who's actually cutting those fences. Because when I find out, and I will find out, there's going to be a reckoning. The two men stared at each other for a long moment, the air crackling with unspoken threats. Finally, Calhoun swung back up into his saddle. Watch yourself, Bradford. And watch that wife of yours. Some women bring nothing but trouble to a man's life. After the riders disappeared into the darkness, William remained standing at the porch railing, his hands clenched into fists. Rosalie could see the anger radiating from him like heat from a forge. He's wrong about me, she said quietly, about my family. I know that. William turned to face her, and she was surprised to see not doubt in his eyes, but fury on her behalf. But knowing it and proving it are two different things. Calhoun's got influence in this valley. If he starts spreading rumors, people will believe them, Rosalie finished, because it's easier to blame the outsider, the girl who married for money, than to admit they don't know who's really behind the attacks. That's exactly what he's counting on. William's jaw tightened. But I won't let him destroy you or your family to cover for his own failures. We're going to solve this, Rosalie, together. The word together sent a warm flutter through her chest. In the months since their wedding, William had shown her kindness, respect, and patience. But this was different. This was the first time he'd spoken to her as a true partner, an equal in facing whatever challenges lay ahead. What can I do? She asked. Help me think. You know this valley, know the people. Who would benefit from creating chaos among the ranchers? Who has reason to want any of us gone? Rosalie considered the question seriously. She'd grown up here, had watched the community dynamics play out over years of church services, town gatherings, and her father's interactions with various neighbors. There's been talk for months about the railroad company wanting to buy up land for a new rail line, she said slowly. If ranchers were struggling, if their cattle kept getting scattered and their fences kept getting cut, they might be more willing to sell at a lower price, William finished. That's good thinking. What else? Mr. Jameson's been buying up properties when people can't make their payments. And there's been rumors about some kind of mining operation wanting to lease land for surveys. She paused, remembering conversations she'd overheard. But those are just possibilities. We need proof. We need information, William agreed, and I think I know where to start getting it. The next morning brought a new crisis that pushed their investigation to the back burner. Rosa met them at breakfast with red eyes and a telegram clutched in her trembling hands. From your madre, she said to Rosalie. Those men, they came back. They took the cow and the chickens. Said if she doesn't have the money by tomorrow, they'll take the cabin too. Rosalie's heart sank as she read the desperate message. Her mother's careful handwriting revealed how dire the situation had become. The debt collectors weren't waiting for Friday. They were squeezing Bridget Murphy now, taking what little she had left to survive. That settles it, William said, pushing back from the table. We're riding to town today. I'm going to the bank to arrange payment for your mother's debts, and then we're going to have a conversation with whoever's behind this collection agency. William, you don't have to. Yes, I do. His tone brooked no argument. This is exactly the kind of pressure tactic Calhoun would use to force people out. Your mother's situation might be connected to the ranch attacks. An hour later, they were in William's wagon heading toward town, with Rosa accompanying them to help with errands. The journey gave Rosalie time to think about how dramatically her life had changed. A month ago, she would have faced her mother's crisis alone, desperate and helpless. Now she had William beside her, committed to solving problems that weren't originally his. But as they approached the town's main street, Rosalie noticed something that made her stomach clench with anxiety. Small groups of people stood on corners and in front of shops, their conversations stopping abruptly when the Bradford wagon came into view. The looks they received weren't friendly. Word's gotten around, William murmured, noticing the hostile stares. Calhoun's been busy. At the bank, the situation became even clearer. Mr. Pemberton, the bank president, who'd always been cordial to William, greeted them with obvious discomfort. Mr. Bradford, Mrs. Bradford, he said formally. What can I do for you today? I need to arrange payment for some outstanding debts, William explained. The Murphy family obligations. I understand there's an urgency to the matter. Pemberton shifted uncomfortably. Well, yes, there have been some complications with that account. It seems the debt collection agency has raised questions about the legitimacy of certain arrangements. What kind of questions? Rosalie asked, though she had a sinking feeling she already knew. Questions about whether marriage agreements made under duress can be considered valid for debt transfer purposes, Pemberton said carefully. They're suggesting that the original arrangement between you and Mr. Bradford might not be legally binding for covering family obligations. William's eyes hardened. That's ridiculous, and you know it, Pemberton. I'm prepared to pay these debts in full right now. What's the legal impediment? None technically, the banker admitted, but the collection agency has suggested they might pursue legal action if payment comes from questionable sources. They're implying the marriage itself might be fraudulent. The accusation hung in the air like a poison cloud. Rosalie felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. Not only were they questioning her family's integrity, they were attacking the very foundation of her marriage to William. I see, William said quietly, but Rosalie could hear the steel beneath his calm tone. And who exactly is making these implications? The Rocky Mountain Collection Agency. They're new to the area, but they seem to have significant backing. I'm told they're affiliated with some larger business interests. Business interests like railroad companies, mining operations. Pemberton's uncomfortable silence was answer enough. They left the bank with the debt payment made, but the larger problem unresolved. The collection agency had been paid off, but the attack on their marriage's legitimacy suggested this was about more than just Bridget Murphy's debts. They're trying to isolate us, William said, as they walked down the main street toward Rosa's shopping destination. Make us look like criminals or fraudsters so no one will support us when the real trouble starts. What real trouble? Rosalie asked, though she was beginning to understand. Whatever they're planning that requires destabilizing the local ranchers. If they can make us look like the source of the problems, they can eliminate opposition to whatever scheme they're running. Their conversation was interrupted by a familiar voice calling Rosalie's name. She turned to see her friend Mary Kowalski approaching, but Mary's usual warm smile was strained. "Rosalie," Mary said carefully, "I'm glad I ran into you. I wanted you to know, well, there's been talk." "What kind of talk?" Mary glanced around nervously before stepping closer. "People are saying you might have information about who's been attacking the ranches. Some folks think, well, they think maybe your family's mixed up in it somehow." "That's ridiculous," Rosalie said hotly. "My mother can barely afford to feed herself. What possible reason would she have to attack ranches?" "I know it's ridiculous," Mary said quickly, "but that man Calhoun, he's been asking questions. Talking about debts and desperate people, and how sometimes folks do desperate things." William stepped closer to Rosalie, his presence both protective and supportive. "Mary, has anyone actually seen anything suspicious? Or are these just rumors based on coincidental timing?" "Just rumors as far as I know," Mary admitted. "But Mr. Bradford, you know how people talk in a small town. Once stories get started, they take on a life of their own," William finished grimly. That afternoon, as they prepared to head home, they received an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Morrison approached their wagon with obvious reluctance, his weathered face showing the strain of whatever news he carried. "William, Mrs. Bradford," he said, touching his hat brim, "I'm afraid I need to ask you both some questions." "About what?" William asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected. "There was another attack last night. The Hendersons lost about 20 head of cattle, and their barn was set on fire. Billy Henderson says he saw riders heading in the direction of your place afterward." Rosalie's heart sank. Billy, the same boy who'd brought news of her mother's troubles, was now placing them near the scene of another attack. "Sheriff," William said carefully, "what exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything, but I've got people asking questions, demanding answers. Calhoun's group is putting pressure on me to investigate everyone who might have information about these attacks." "Including my wife?" "Including everyone, William." "I'm sorry, but I've got to ask. Where were you both last night between 10 and midnight?" "At home," Rosalie said immediately. "William was checking on the cattle after we'd heard about fence cutting, and I was in the house with Rosa." "Can Rosa verify that?" "Of course she can," William said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "But Sheriff, you've known me for 15 years. Do you really think I'd be involved in rustling my neighbor's cattle?" Morrison's discomfort was evident. "No, William, I don't. But I've got a job to do, and right now that job includes asking hard questions of everyone who might have answers." As the sheriff walked away, Rosalie felt the weight of isolation settling over them like a heavy blanket. The community that had welcomed her marriage with polite skepticism was now viewing them both with open suspicion. "They're going to keep coming after us," she said quietly. "Until they find someone to blame for these attacks, we're going to be their primary suspects." "Then we'd better find the real culprits first," William replied, "because I'll be damned if I let them destroy what we're building together." The determination in his voice surprised her. Somewhere along the way, their convenient arrangement had become something William was willing to fight for. And for the first time since their wedding day, Rosalie realized she was willing to fight for it too. The breakthrough came 3 days later, in the most unexpected way possible. Rosalie was hanging laundry behind the house when she noticed dust rising from the north road. Not the heavy cloud that signaled multiple riders, but the lighter trail of a single horse moving fast. As the figure drew closer, she recognized Billy Henderson again, but this time his urgency seemed different. Less panicked, more excited. "Mrs. Bradford," he called out as he approached. "Is Mr. Bradford here? I've got something important to tell him." William emerged from the barn, where he'd been checking on a mare about to foal. His expression was wary. Too many unexpected visitors lately had brought bad news. "What is it, Billy?" he asked. The boy dismounted quickly, his young face flushed with excitement and something that looked like guilt. "Mr. Bradford, I need to tell you something about what I saw the other night. About those riders." William's attention sharpened immediately. "Go on." Well, you see, I was out checking our fence line like Pa told me to, and I did see riders heading toward your place. But Billy swallowed hard, clearly struggling with something. But I saw them coming from our place too. And one of them, he had this real distinctive horse, a big gray with white markings on his face. You recognize the horse? Rosalie asked. Yes, ma'am. It belongs to Jake Morrison, the sheriff's own son. The implications hit like a thunderbolt. Sheriff Morrison's son, involved in the very attacks his father was investigating. No wonder the sheriff had seemed so uncomfortable when questioning them. He'd been trying to deflect attention from his own family. Billy, William said carefully, why didn't you mention this before? The boy's face reddened. Because Jake Morrison told me if I said anything, he'd make sure my family got blamed for everything. Said he had friends who could make our lives real difficult. He paused, then added in a rush, but I can't let you and Mrs. Bradford get in trouble for something you didn't do. It ain't right. William placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. That took courage, Billy. More courage than most grown men would have shown. There's more, Billy continued. I followed them part way that night, just to see where they were really going. They didn't head to your place at all. They went to that old line shack near Devil's Canyon, the one that's been abandoned for years. You think they're using it as a meeting place? Rosalie asked. Could be. And Mr. Bradford? I saw something else yesterday when I was hunting near there. There's been surveying going on. Someone's marked trees and driven stakes into the ground, like they're planning to build something. William and Rosalie exchanged glances. The pieces were starting to fit together. The railroad company's interest, the systematic attacks on ranchers, the pressure to sell land cheap. Someone was orchestrating a campaign to destabilize the valley's cattle operations. Billy, I want you to go home and tell your father everything you just told us, William said, but don't mention it to anyone else yet. If Jake Morrison is involved, there might be others, and we don't know who we can trust. After Billy left, William turned to Rosalie with a grim expression. We need proof. Real evidence that connects the attacks to whoever's behind this land grab scheme. You're thinking of going to that line shack, Rosalie said. It wasn't a question. Tonight, after dark. If they're using it as a base of operations, there might be supplies, papers, something that proves what they're up to. I'm coming with you. William shook his head immediately. Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. William, Rosalie said firmly, if you get caught out there alone, who's going to believe your side of the story? But if I'm with you, I can testify to what we find. 2 witnesses are better than 1. Rosalie, we're partners, remember? You said it yourself. Partners share their troubles and work together to solve them. He stared at her for a long moment, and she could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. The protective husband warring with the practical man who knew she was right. If we do this, he said finally, you follow my lead completely. No arguments, no heroics. If I tell you to run, you run. Agreed. That night they rode out under a quarter moon, taking a circuitous route that would keep them away from the main roads. William had armed himself with a rifle and his sidearm, while Rosalie carried a smaller pistol he'd insisted she take. The weight of it in her pocket was both comforting and terrifying. The line shack sat in a small clearing surrounded by dense woods, its windows dark and apparently empty. But as they approached on foot leading their horses, Rosalie could see signs of recent activity. Fresh wheel ruts in the dirt, a pile of ashes from a recent fire, supplies stacked under a lean-to that definitely hadn't been there when the shack was abandoned. Someone's definitely been using this place, William whispered. They tied their horses at the edge of the clearing and crept closer to the building. Through a gap in the shutters, William peered inside, then motioned for Rosalie to look. What she saw made her heart race. The interior of the shack had been transformed into a makeshift headquarters. Maps covered one wall, marked with red X's that she realized corresponded to the locations of recent attacks. A table held neat stacks of papers, and she could make out what looked like property deeds and survey reports. We need to get inside, William murmured. The door was locked, but William had brought tools for that possibility. Within minutes, they were inside the shack, examining the evidence that would finally prove their innocence. The maps told the whole story. Every ranch that had been attacked was marked, along with notations about property values, debt levels, and estimated sale prices. But more damning were the papers on the table: contracts with the Rocky Mountain Collection Agency, correspondence with the Transcontinental Railroad Company, and a list of local men who'd been recruited to carry out the attacks. Jake Morrison's name was there, along with several others that Rosalie recognized as men who'd been struggling financially. They'd been offered money to create chaos in the valley, preparing the way for the railroad to acquire land at bargain prices. "This is it," William said grimly, photographing the documents with a small camera he'd brought. "This proves everything." But their moment of triumph was short-lived. The sound of approaching horses reached them just as William finished with the last document. "We need to go," he said urgently. "Now!" They slipped out the back of the shack just as the first riders entered the clearing. Through the trees, Rosalie could see torches and hear voices. At least 6 men, probably more. "Bradford," a voice called out, Calhoun's voice. "We know you're here. Come out and face the consequences of your actions." William pulled Rosalie deeper into the woods, moving as quietly as possible through the underbrush. But they were too late. One of the riders had circled around and spotted their horses. "Over here," the man shouted. "They're trying to get away." What followed was a terrifying chase through the dark forest, with William and Rosalie stumbling over roots and dodging low branches, while their pursuers crashed through the woods behind them. William's knowledge of the terrain gave them an advantage, but they were outnumbered and on foot. They finally reached a creek bed where William had hidden a second set of horses earlier that day, insurance against exactly this situation. As they mounted up, gunshots rang out behind them, and Rosalie heard bullets whining through the trees. "Ride!" William shouted, and they galloped through the night toward home. They didn't speak until they were safely back at the ranch, both of them shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. Rosa met them at the door, her face etched with worry. "Gracias a Dios," she whispered, crossing herself. "I heard the shooting in the distance." "We got what we needed," William told her, patting the camera in his pocket. "Evidence that will clear our names and expose the real criminals." But as Rosalie sank into a chair in the kitchen, the full weight of what they'd been through hit her. They'd risked their lives tonight, had nearly been killed for seeking the truth. And through it all, William had protected her, trusted her, treated her as an equal partner in every decision. "William," she said quietly, "why did you let me come with you tonight? Really?" He looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw something that made her breath catch. "Because somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking of you as my arrangement wife and started thinking of you as my partner. As the woman I—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "The woman you what?" she prompted softly. "The woman I love," he said simply. "I love you, Rosalie. Not because I have to, not because it's convenient, but because you're brave and strong and kind, and you've made me remember what it feels like to want to protect something precious." The words hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Rosalie's heart pounded as she realized that what she'd been feeling for weeks now finally had a name. "I love you too," she whispered. "I didn't expect to. Didn't think it was possible, but somehow it happened anyway," William finished. When he kissed her this time, it wasn't the polite peck of their wedding day or the gentle brush of lips she'd grown accustomed to. It was the kiss of a man claiming his wife, of a woman accepting her husband, of 2 people who'd found something real in the most unlikely circumstances. Outside, the first light of dawn was beginning to touch the horizon, but inside the Bradford kitchen, 2 hearts had finally found their way home. The trial of the Rocky Mountain Collection Agency conspirators became the biggest news the valley had seen in decades. William's photographs, combined with Billy Henderson's testimony and the physical evidence found at the line shack, exposed a web of corruption that reached all the way to the territorial capital. Jake Morrison and 5 other local men were sentenced to prison for their roles in the cattle rustling and property destruction. Calhoun, revealed as the local coordinator for the railroad company's illegal land acquisition scheme, fled the territory before he could be arrested. The collection agency was disbanded, their assets seized to compensate the ranchers who'd suffered losses. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when Sheriff Morrison, faced with irrefutable evidence of his son's crimes, publicly apologized to William and Rosalie for the suspicion they'd endured. I let personal shame cloud my judgment, he admitted at the town meeting, where the truth was finally revealed. The Bradfords showed more courage and integrity than any of us, and they deserve our respect, not our suspicion. The community's attitude toward the unusual marriage shifted overnight. What had once been seen as a scandalous arrangement between a desperate girl and a lonely older man was now viewed as a love story that had triumphed over adversity. The woman who'd married for money had become the woman who'd risked her life to save her neighbors' livelihoods. 6 months after their wedding day, Rosalie stood in the same blue room where she'd spent her first night as Mrs. Bradford. But everything had changed. The nervous stranger who'd accepted a marriage of convenience was gone, replaced by a confident woman who'd found her place in the world. "Are you ready?" William asked from the doorway, adjusting his tie with the same nervous energy he'd shown on their original wedding day. Today they were renewing their vows, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. This time, the promises would be made with full hearts and honest intentions, witnessed by a community that had learned not to judge too quickly. "More than ready," Rosalie replied, smoothing the silk of her new wedding dress, a gift from William that had been chosen for joy rather than necessity. The ceremony took place in their own front yard, beneath the same oak tree where they'd exchanged their first awkward vows. But where that gathering had been marked by pity and speculation, this celebration overflowed with genuine happiness. Bridget Murphy, now living comfortably in the ranch's guest cottage, dabbed at her eyes as her daughter spoke new vows with unmistakable love in her voice. Rosa beamed with maternal pride, having helped plan every detail of the celebration. Even Billy Henderson, now considered a local hero for his courage in exposing the truth, grinned widely as he watched the couple he'd helped save. "William Bradford," Rosalie said, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd, "I promise to love you not because circumstances forced us together, but because you showed me what love truly means. You gave me respect when I had nothing to offer but debt and desperation. You gave me partnership when I was prepared to be a servant. You gave me your heart when I thought mine was too broken to love again." William's response brought tears to many eyes, including Rosalie's own. "Rosalie Murphy Bradford, you came into my life when I thought my heart was buried with my first family. You showed me that love doesn't diminish when it's shared, it multiplies. You proved that the strongest marriages aren't built on passion alone, but on trust, respect, and the courage to face whatever challenges come our way. Together." When Reverend Walsh pronounced them husband and wife for the second time, the kiss they shared was nothing like the polite peck of their first ceremony. This was the kiss of two people who'd earned their happiness through trials that would have broken weaker bonds. As the celebration continued into the evening, with Rosa's feast and dancing that lasted until the stars came out, Rosalie found herself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought them here. She'd entered this marriage as a sacrifice, a woman selling herself to save her family. But somehow, in the midst of economic necessity and social pressure, she'd found something she'd never dared hope for, a true partnership with a man who saw her as an equal. Their love story might not have begun with romance, but it had grown into something stronger than passion alone. It was built on mutual respect, shared trials, and the gradual recognition that they were better together than either had ever been apart. As William swept her into his arms for their first dance as truly married partners, Rosalie marveled at how dramatically a life could change. A year ago, she'd been a desperate girl with no prospects. Tonight, she was a woman beloved by a good man, respected by her community.